Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Bera wash processed Ethiopia from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And this coffee is our June 2023 Coffee of the Month, as it was selected by you guys as the coffee you most wanted to see us review. And this coffee was selected as one of our nominees because it is described as a darker profiled berry forward coffee with excellent sweetness. And that did catch my interest because this is a wash processed coffee. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was pushing the extraction a bit at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 100 degrees Celsius, about 212 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we went a bit more fine with the grind on this one as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, Say is notorious for being one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters in the United States, even with their more modern profile being slightly more developed than it used to be. This one is a bit lighter than some of the coffees that we have reviewed from them up to this point this year. So we will say that this one is on the lighter side of Say's more modern profile, which is still a pretty light coffee in general. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and opted for the V60, and the first thing I noticed was that the coffee came out a little bit more light and delicate than initially expected, although it did have that slightly darker flavor profile to the cup, with a focus on a very well-defined cherry aspect. A light florality followed as well, but for the most part, it's a little bit more tame than initially expected, so not necessarily the best first impression. Continue on to day 18, ran through the Chemex, and it was a much better day this time around, as it was offering a bit more sweetness and overall definition with even more of the cherry forward aspect to the cup. Tempered brightness in general with more florality, as there's a lingering sweetness underneath all of it, but for the most part, it's still been a pretty tame coffee. Day 21, ran it through the April brewer, and it seems like the coffee is just naturally improving with time, as it continues to offer a very unique cherry aspect. And the reason I describe it as being more unique is because cherry isn't typically the most defined flavor profile experience from pretty much any coffee. So when I do get a very cherry forward coffee, especially for a washed processed coffee, it is kind of interesting in that sense, especially considering that this one was very well defined and articulated, enough to the point where it wasn't maybe a more standard cherry, but as they describe on here, a Rainier cherry. I could see it being a little bit more akin to that as opposed to a more generic cherry in general. It continues to feel like it's verging on improvement with a lingering sweetness underneath a soft floral base, but for the most part, the coffee continues to remain delicate overall. Day 24, up to the temperatures, and there honestly wasn't too much of a change with this adjustment, as it continues to remain pretty consistent. There's a little bit more sweetness today. Definition to cherry remains pretty strong, but other than that, it continues to remain a lighter profiled coffee with a lot of Ethiopian characteristics, that being maybe just a slightly lighter body. Pretty clean in general, not too much to take away on this day. Day 26, same adjustments to the Chemex, and the coffee was actually the best it had been up to this point, as it felt like there was a bit more vibrancy as it started to skew a little bit more too on the cherry fresh fruit direction. It's very well defined with a complementary florality, and as you can see from up to this point, the notes have been pretty consistent because this coffee has really just skewed strong in those two directions. Day 29, increase the concentration with a heavier pour and a more fine grind, and the cup feels moderately improved as there's a faint berry to complement that cherry-like fruit aspect, which they have mixed berry listed as the other thing, and it was a very faint mixed berry, if anything. The cherry really seemed to continue to dominate it, as it felt, yet again, pretty delicate in general. It's offering a little bit more brightness, but for the most part, that part's tame too. Everything's pretty tame in this coffee, even the sweetness, even with these adjustments. Day 32, same adjustments through the V60, and I decided to stick with the Chemex, and I decided to stick with the V60 as the preferred brew method because this one came out even more faint and delicate, so there are some more subtle berry components and somehow even less brightness than experienced from earlier. So this one was a tricky coffee with a little less definition. Honestly, I feel like I had better results with the Chemex on earlier days before making these sort of adjustments. So day 35, back through the V60 with the same day 29 adjustments, and it just felt like it was lacking much of anything, if I'm being completely honest. It does have that very defined cherry aspect with a slightly sweeter sense to it, but honestly, that's about it. Slight florality, faint berries, little brightness, almost no body, and in general, it was just a little bit more unusual than I might have been expecting for something like this. All right, well, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 4 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4, I don't think I have too much to say on that. No part of that is surprising. We do have a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. It's always going to be pretty strong on that sense. If anything, maybe on the slightly higher side of the level 4, because it is a very clean coffee in general. It does have a very well-defined profile to it. Typically, as I say, that 5 is reserved for like geishas and overly clean coffees. This one right here is still very clean, so if I want to give it a compliment, then we're going to say higher side of level 4. Finish, level 4. That one, on the other hand, is a little bit more generous. I would say that this one is on the lower side of the level 4, as it does have a little bit of a finish, but not to the extent that I might have been expecting. It's a very faint and delicate finish in general, but I feel like it's lasting enough, at least in the cherry profile, to justify maybe reaching the bottom level of that 4. So level 4, a little generous in that sense. Sweetness, level 4. This is kind of a big one. So this one right here, I would say yet again on the lower side of level 4, was being a little generous with this one. And that's why it really stumped me that they listed excellent sweetness on the description of this coffee, because this one is definitely not the sweetest coffee I've had from Say. It's a little bit more in the middle of the pack. And there are a lot of coffees we've had from them that kind of finish in that level 3 mark. This one right here, it said at times you can feel that kind of lingering sweetness underneath, and it's most specifically in a fruit sense. Even then, not a very strong part of this coffee, so I would actually say lower side of the level 4. Berry fruit, level 4. Yes, that one right there is definitely a true level 4, as that does insinuate a lot of the cherry components to it. Now, if I'm looking for some of the other things that are within this coffee, then I feel like maybe the bottom level of a 3 is even at that point being a little generous, as that mixed berry component that I have listed on here, I really struggled to get out. That being said, I really want to emphasize just how well-defined the cherry profile was present within this one, as once again, they have Rainier cherry listed, and I could say that this is the closest coffee I've ever had to tasting like a Rainier cherry, so they have at least that part going from them. And then a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3, and that's one of the first takeaways I had from this coffee. Was it was surprisingly lacking in the brightness that I was expecting for it being a Say coffee. So that was a very interesting part of this one. It's one of the maybe least bright acidic Say coffees I've had in quite a while, so don't really know what to make of that. Florality, level 3. That's the second note I took away right from the start, was that this one felt like a little bit more delicate floral of a cup of coffee, at least at the onset. So I think that it's good there at that level 3 mark. At times I could have justified it being an equal measure to the cherry component, so level 4, maybe higher side of level 3 for this one. That seems like a good fit. And then I feel like the last thing worth discussing is the body at level 2. And that's pretty interesting because, as I kind of mentioned, this was brewed with the V60, and Ethiopian coffees in general don't necessarily have the most body. But what really surprised me about this one was this is probably on the lower side of level 2, even with the brew method that we opted for on this one, as I was kind of surprised that this one also came out a little bit more just watery in general. It didn't necessarily have a whole lot of structure to the body, so that's interesting in that sense. But as I'm kind of looking at this tasting wheel and trying this coffee once again here on day 38, I feel like this is actually a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think it's pretty safe to assume that this one wasn't necessarily my favorite. I feel like I went into it with much higher expectations than it turned out to be. And I think what I was looking for from this coffee was maybe a little bit more natural-like in terms of the vibrancy. I was expecting a bunch of sweetness, a bunch of very strong, very forward aspects, and it didn't really seem to deliver on either of those two things, as it had a much more delicate base to it in general, which on paper you should expect for a wash process Ethiopian coffee. And that's why I want to say that maybe their marketing did a very good job on selling this coffee to me, because I was fully expecting it to be something that it didn't end up being. But that being said, it's going to leave me a little disappointed for the overall results, because I was really hoping to get a very vibrant, sweet, strong profiled coffee, whereas I got a much more delicate, tame, moderate coffee in general. So I feel like this one is definitely maybe one of the biggest victim of expectations that we've ever done on this channel, because I don't think that this coffee was bad by any means. I feel like if you would have served me this coffee at a coffee shop and I would have had it a couple of times, I would have said, okay, this is just a very faint cup of coffee. I'm used to maybe having stuff like this from Say. But given that I went into it with such high expectations, I feel like that's one of the main reasons I was let down in the way that I was. But that does lead me to the type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and the best way I can direct somebody for this one is somebody that really likes their much more delicate and cherry focused coffees, because even though I'm a big fan of cherry in general, especially when it's not in the heavier, more natural anaerobic sense, this one right here didn't really seem to give me much else of anything else within this coffee. The florality was okay, the sweetness was okay, not a whole lot of brightness, which I typically wouldn't complain about. But given that this one didn't offer too much else, then it really seemed to go in one direction. This is maybe one of the most one-note coffees I've had from Say in general, as I don't think it offered too much complexity or depth. It just really seemed to hone in and focus on that one aspect. But as I always say, it could have been on me for struggling to get this one right, as that can be the case as well. So Say's coffees are tricky. This one came out a little tricky, not necessarily my favorite, but I will leave it at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Bera wash processed Ethiopia from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.